biggest problems is that I attract the weirdest kinds of people. There are a lot of people who say that, but you have no idea until you've met some of the people that try to hang out with me. There was one guy who took the cake, though. His name was Jonathan. He lived down the road from my parents' house. This was years ago, and thankfully I hadn't had anything to do with him in a very long time. I was your average-looking girl. I was in high school at the time, and I was extremely naive. I've had a couple of really bad experiences. I've kind of been shown the true horror of the world firsthand. Not trying to turn this into a pity party or anything, but you don't realize how cruel the world is until horrible things happen to you. And if you were idealistic about people the way I was, you'll just have to live through some bad experiences to find out. But anyway, back when I was a sophomore in high school and extremely naive about people and their intentions, I was friends with Jonathan. I thought that he was kind of a nerdy guy, but that he was capable of being a friend. Bear in mind, he was a 30-year-old who lived with his grandmother who collected Social Security. He didn't have a job, didn't have a girlfriend, and he thought it was a good idea to hang out with a girl in high school that lived down the street. That's the kind of guy Jonathan was. I wasn't really close with my parents, so they didn't really know anything about who I hung out with. I didn't hang out with Jonathan very much, but I would say hi to him and have the occasional conversation from time to time. Looking back, I knew that he had some kind of crush or romantic feeling for me, but I knew that it would be against the rules for him to date me, and I knew that he knew that too. But I remember when I got my first boyfriend, Jonathan was not exactly happy about it. He kept warning me about being used by boys my age. He told me that I should look for an older man who was more mature and could take care of me. Of course, he was always hinting that I should have been with him. He didn't want to come out and say it, though. But every single time I ever talked about my boyfriend, who had only been dating for 2 weeks or so, Jonathan always had something bad to say or some kind of warning. I remember getting the whole possibly catching something from him talk from my parents, only to get it again from Jonathan. I specifically remember the way he phrased the conversation. He talked as if though my boyfriend definitely had some sort of disease, and by the way, he didn't. It was a very strange ordeal nonetheless. But then came the day before our field trip. It wasn't a big trip or anything. My school was divided into certain sections, and it was an annual event where the science department would take certain sections of students down to the park and help us scientifically observe nature. For 3 days, the scientific department would take a third of the students down in this park. It was pretty stupid. Everyone kind of agreed that it was just a nice way to get out of those horrible classrooms that we sit in all day. Outside Science Day, that's what we called it. I remember Jonathan asking about Outside Science Day. He asked what day I was going to be in the park. I told him, and I was scheduled to go Wednesday. I didn't think anything of it. After all, he did go to the same high school I went to, and it was kind of a tradition. I thought that he was just kind of curious or reminiscing. Wow, was I wrong. Wednesday came, and I was really excited to be going down to the park. I was hanging out with my best friend Rebecca. We got down there and started observing nature. The teachers made me bring notepads and pencils to make some scientific observations, but after a few sentences, they didn't care what we did after that. The teachers sat by the picnic tables and drank lemonade, and us students were pretty much free to do whatever we wanted. Me and Rebecca were having a deep conversation about life. She said something about her stepfather and how it made her feel like marriage was a bad idea or something. I don't really remember, it was a very long time ago. I just remember being 100% engaged in this conversation with Rebecca. And all of a sudden, I felt a hand touch my shoulder. I thought it was one of my friends playing a joke on me or something, but I turned around and it was Jonathan. Things got extremely awkward really fast. Me and Rebecca were kind of in the middle of it, and here was my awkward older neighbor showing up at my school class trip. Jonathan asked me if I wanted to go back with him to hang out at his house for a little while. I told him that I would get in trouble, but he promised that the teachers would never find out. By this point, I knew exactly what he was doing, and I wasn't about to play into that. I told him that I couldn't leave my best friend Rebecca, but then he offered to bring Rebecca too. And that was even creepier. I remember getting a look from Rebecca like, "Why do you know this, freak?" After Jonathan kept pleading with us, me and Rebecca finally decided to just walk back to our teachers and hope that Jonathan would get the hint. But when we started walking through, Jonathan grabbed me. He grabbed me by the ankle and I fell to the ground. We were standing on wood chips and I remember getting some in my mouth when I fell. He started dragging me. We were far enough from the teachers that they couldn't see us easily, and our view was mostly obstructed from the rest of the students by a swing set, so nobody noticed that this grown man was dragging me away. I lucked out in the end. Rebecca actually started fighting him. She punched him in the nose and started screaming for the teachers. Right after she did that, Jonathan started running. He ran as fast as I've ever seen anyone run away in my life. I didn't realize how quick he actually was. The teachers asked about the incident and questioned me as to whether or not I knew this man. I told them that I didn't. It turned into a giant headache. They called the police and everything. I told the police that it was just a stranger, and then I was as vague as I could be when I described him. For some reason, I felt like I would get in trouble if they knew it was Jonathan. Now, I understood that I should have reported him to the police, but I foolishly didn't at my naive age. The experience turned into a good thing for Rebecca, too. She always bragged about punching a grown man in the face and him running away. I was pretty sure that Jonathan was running because he didn't want the teachers to see him, and not because Rebecca's punch necessarily hurt him that bad. But I never told Rebecca that. After that incident, Jonathan never showed his face anywhere near me ever again. I think he was familiar enough with my schedule that he knew when I got on and off the bus, and he just stayed away from me. That was the first time in my life that I was faced with this sort of dark reality. The sad reality that someone who claimed to be my friend actually had very dark and sinister intentions all along, and anyone with two eyes could have seen. If you're like me, do yourself a favor and be more cynical about people. At least that way, the only surprises will be good ones. This happened a very long time ago to me and my best friend at the time. We'll call him Steven. Me and Steven have been very rebellious kids growing up. We both came from single mother homes and spent most of our time doing things that we knew we probably shouldn't be doing. When we were in 7th or 8th grade, I can't remember anymore, we went on a field trip. Now we live in a small town and it was as boring as you might imagine, but the field trip was to New York City. This is going to be the trip of our lives, or so we thought. For a couple of days leading up to the trip, we talked about all the stuff that we were going to buy, and it was going to be amazing. Nobody was more excited for this trip than we were. When the day for the field trip finally came, it was actually really bad weather. The rain was pretty bad, and it was also a little foggy for some reason. Suffice to say, the visibility was actually a lot lower than it usually was, which is going to be important later in the story. The teachers told us before we even set foot on the bus that we had to stick with the class. They told us that we could walk with our friends if we wanted to, but that we all had to kind of stay together. Me and Steven thought this was lame, and again, we were those rebellious kinds of kids, so I'm sure you know where this is headed. We actually didn't want to break away from the group right away, but the teachers refused to bring us to the store we wanted to go to, literally a store for aspiring rappers. Oh, and if you're wondering, yes, I'm out of that phase by now. Steven isn't, but thankfully I am at least. We were convinced that we needed to buy some equipment to launch our rap careers, and looking back, I don't know what we thought we were going to even buy in there. We both had about $20 or $30 each, and all the recording equipment and stereos and whatnot were easily in the hundreds of dollars. But we weren't the brightest of kids, I guess you could say. About 15 minutes later, we hatched our plan secretly. We were going to just sneak off when no one was looking and sneak our way back into the group after we got what we wanted. We figured that because there were so many students on the trip, then we were going to be fine and nobody was going to notice. And that's when we did it. We waited until the entire class was crossing the street and we just kept walking on the sidewalk that we had been on. It took us a very long time to actually find the wrap store that we wanted to go to. But we eventually found it, and it was as disappointing as you might imagine. Walking into a store when you want to buy everything but you can only afford a pack of gum. After making the walk of shame out of the store, we realized that it was time to find our class again. Now, it's probably important to note how obvious it was that we were young. I said that we were in the 7th or 8th grade. We looked even younger than 7th or 8th graders. We probably looked like we could have been the oldest kids in the elementary school. Stephen was really short, maybe around 5'2", and I was only a little bit taller than he was. We were also carrying around backpacks, which made us even more obvious that we were kids. So there we were, walking around the streets of New York City, wandering aimlessly in hopes of finding our class. This was probably our worst mistake, because we eventually wandered off into one of the sketchier parts of the city. Have you ever gone from a nice part of the city, where the tourism happens, and then you find yourself in the run-down part of the city where you roll up your windows because you might get shot? It's a really weird experience, and to be so young and to go through it without a car made it especially memorable. Me and Stephen had no idea what we were going to do, and that was when a strange man started following us. He was a lot older. He had to have been at least 50 or so. He was very overweight and just gave off one of the creepiest vibes you could imagine. He started telling us that he lost his dog and that he needed help finding it. Surprisingly enough, we did decline helping him because we were a little worried since he was so sketchy. We just told him that we were too busy looking for our class. Again, another stupid move on our parts. That was when he started getting closer and closer to us. Me and Stephen gave each other one good look and knew that we had to run, especially because this was one of the parts of the city that not many people were around. If this guy really wanted to get us and do something horrible, he could have probably brought us into an alleyway and done whatever he wanted, and nobody would have known or seen it. But by a stroke of luck, we managed to sprint our way back to the populated part of the city. There was a lot of people around, and we looked back around to see if he had followed us. Neither one of us had actually turned around while we were running. We didn't see him, but we still felt really uneasy. We were leaning against the wall trying to catch our breath when we saw him again. He grabbed Stephen by the arm and started yanking on him. I remember being so horrified and not knowing what to do. Thankfully, Stephen started screaming at the top of his lungs, and someone had intervened and told this creep to buzz off and let Stephen go. He didn't put up much of a fight, just kind of let Stephen go and started to walk off as if though nothing had happened. We also lucked out because our class just happened to be within an earshot distance and heard Stephen screaming. I guess one of the teachers had recognized his voice. They got back over with us, and the teachers were so angry, as you might imagine. We got in a lot of trouble for breaking away from the group, especially because that really put us in harm's way. I remember one of the male teachers going on this massive rant about the stupidity of our decision. He told us that if we had been a little less lucky that day, we both could have ended up dead. This turned out to be a really big event in my personal life because that was when I kind of straightened out and stopped acting so rebellious all the time. It's a little sad that something so traumatic was what straightened me out, but if it happened to you, I'm sure you would feel the exact same way. Because now I have this really strong association with breaking the rules and possibly ending up dead or kidnapped. I know it's not logical and doesn't actually make sense, but I guess that's the impression something like this leaves on you. But anyway, that's the story of how me and my best friend Stephen were nearly kidnapped by a creepy old man when we visited New York City a long time ago. I don't remember very much about the story. It happened when I was very young, but looking back, it may have been one of the most horrifying of my life. We were going to visit the panda bears in Washington, D.C. They were going to be so cool. I remember our entire class looking forward to the field trip for weeks before it actually happened. The day of the field trip, I was in awe. I've never actually seen panda bears in person, and I just remember being so mesmerized by everything. The first half of the day went by in a way that you might imagine. After about 40 minutes looking at the panda bears, that got kind of old and we moved on to something else. We started looking at some of the other animals, and I remember looking at all of them and wondering how these animals even existed without me knowing about it. I remember just sitting there for a long time and just staring at these animals because I knew that it was going to be a long time before I ever got a chance to see them again. I know, I was a pretty weird kid. We got lunch and then moved on to some more animal observing. We ended up breaking off into smaller groups. There weren't very many of us, so there was about 5 groups of 3. I was with one of my friends and his grandfather, who was one of the nicest old men I'd ever met in my life. He was so nice that he bought me cotton candy when I didn't have enough money myself. But either way, back to the story. Everyone was having a really good time. But when we got into groups, my friend's grandfather was a little bit slower and not as observant over us kids. I'm not saying that he was negligent or anything, definitely not, but he wasn't staring at us the entire time like some of the teachers were, and for that reason, something pretty weird happened to me. I remember standing over by the snakes and looking in and being amazed. As much as they frightened me, I knew that I wasn't in any real danger, so it was pretty cool. I vividly remember there being this one really long snake that had a really colorful design to it. I was staring at it when I noticed something that pulled my attention away. It was a man a few feet away from me taking pictures. Now, there weren't very many other people around, and it was weird the way his camera was angled. I assumed that he was trying to take pictures of the snake, but for some reason he was standing in a position where I was between him and the snakes. It was like I was getting in the way. Without really thinking about it, I moved out of the way like the polite little kid I was. I didn't want to ruin his pictures, but that's when he followed me. He kept taking pictures of me, and it was hands down one of the creepiest things that I've ever had happen to me. Keep in mind, this guy literally had sunglasses on and a mustache. I don't even know how he managed to get into the zoo looking like that, but he did. And he was following me around for a good while, taking pictures of me. And being a naive little kid, I didn't think anything nefarious of it at the time. The whole concept of child predators was very foreign to me. I'd never really heard anything about that due to my parents kind of sheltering me for most of my life. He said in this really, really creepy voice, "Take a pose." And that's exactly what I did. I started acting like a model for him. Again, I didn't really think anything bad of him at this point. In fact, I was under the impression that I was going to be a supermodel. I mean, if you rule out the predator aspect, why else would some random stranger be taking pictures of me? That was my childlike mindset. I remember hearing my friend's grandfather whistle for us to get back over by him, and I did. I looked at the man who had been taking pictures of me really quickly before I left, though. I told him that my name was Jen, and I told him that I wanted my supermodel name to be Jenny Fabulous. I ran back over to my friend's grandfather, and we started making our way to the next exhibit. I don't think he had noticed the man who had been taking pictures of me, and a couple of more hours went by and we were wrapping it up for the day. We were going to see the very last thing, which was going to be the lions. We had gotten back into our class group, so all of the teachers and students were together. This was when that creepy photographer man started noticing me again. He began taking pictures of me in front of the lion exhibit just like he had earlier. Again, I started striking some more poses, as you might expect. That was when one of the teachers started getting involved. She motioned for one of the teachers to take me away while she said something in a very stern tone of voice to that man. They were really good teachers and were looking out for my well-being, so I don't actually know what was said to that man. All I know was that we didn't spend very much time looking at the lions. It was only a few minutes later that we got back on the bus and got back home. It was only years later that I was telling a friend of mine about it when I was in high school, and then it dawned on me. That creepy old man was a child predator, and he was taking pictures of me in hopes of finding me again or possibly doing something horrible to me, maybe even selling those photos. Again, I don't know what exactly my teachers had said or done, but my parents found out about the situation. I don't know what happened to that man, but thankfully, I never heard from him again. The weird thing about dating someone with a mental illness is that they can seem like an otherwise normal person, at least until they snap in whatever way they do. This happened to me with the girl I dated back in high school. We didn't go to the same school, though. She went to our neighbor rival school. There was something of a friendly competition between our two schools. Believe it or not, we actually met at a football game. Anyway, I ended up dating this girl. It was sad because she was actually a really nice person, but her mental illness made her extremely unbearable. She would get into this extremely depressive and anxious mood, and then would act really strange. And it would come about from the most random stuff. I had previously been dating a girl for about 2 years, even before I was in high school, and I totally had a crush on her for a long time before that. Things ended when I found out that she had tried sleeping with one of my friends, and thankfully my friend put bros before hoes and let me know about it immediately. But yeah, I had just stopped with that relationship, so I was in need of a good rebound. And that's where this girl comes in. We'll call her Erica. It was a few weeks after I had been single. I was at this football game just trying to pass the time. That was when I looked over and saw the perfect goth girl. She wasn't overly goth or anything. She didn't even have any piercings or tattoos that I knew of, but she gave off that vibe, if that makes any sense. I had always been interested in girls like that, so I made eye contact with her, got her phone number, and texted her that night. The thing that really made me like her was that she played Xbox. How many times do you ever get a cute girl's number and she also plays video games? I wasn't sure if I was going to ask her out until that point, but she told me her gamer tag was BadChickX42, and I knew I had to go for it. I was normally more careful about vetting girls that I planned on dating, but I figured it would make for a good time. Worst case scenario, I broke up with her because I didn't like her and then I never saw her again. I tell you all this backstory so you can get a good picture of what me and Erica had going on. It was very relaxed, it wasn't serious, and I never once got the idea from her that things were a big deal. She also told me that she had really bad anxiety. When she told me, I didn't think much of it. I figured that everyone gets anxious once in a while, and I had no idea how bad her anxiety actually got. I remember there being this one day when I had a field trip in my school. It was as lame as you can imagine, but it beat sitting in class. So I signed up and was looking forward to the day when it came. The night before the field trip, I didn't text Erica, which was unusual because we normally text each other every night, sometimes into the early hours of the morning. I just wasn't feeling it that night. I was kind of sad, and I just wanted to be alone and eat pizza rolls while I watched That 70s Show. The next day came around, and I forgot that it was the day of the field trip. I wasn't quite dressed to walk around. I had my jeans on, but it wasn't the end of the world. Me and two of my best friends sat together on the bus and waited to get there. I think there were about 3 or 4 buses from our school that left. It was a pretty big field trip, and I think just about everyone in my school went. Now, on to the interesting part. I saw my ex-girlfriend on the field trip. She went to my school, by the way. It was around lunchtime, and she approached me. She tried apologizing for being a bad girlfriend back in the day and tried to actually get back together with me. I wasn't a jerk toward her, but I did tell her no. I told her that I would never be able to trust her again. About a day or two later, she reached out to me again, but this time she asked me if I knew someone, a gothic-looking girl. I guess this goth-looking girl had approached my ex-girlfriend and asked for a whole bunch of questions. I immediately knew it was Erica. I told my ex not to worry about it and that she wouldn't be hearing from this goth girl again. At this point, I felt uneasy about the whole situation. It just seemed like a really strange thing to do. Again, what me and Erica had was not very serious, and the fact that she was kind of stalking me made me feel really anxious. I only knew her for a couple of weeks at this point, and if this was what she was going to do, where is this possibly going to lead? I talked to her about it. She straight up admitted to stalking me while I was on the field trip. She said that she felt anxious about me cheating on her because I didn't text her the night before. Then she told me that she took a couple of pictures of me talking to my ex-girlfriend. She told me that she had somehow found her and confronted her. I felt really anxious at this point and tried not to act shocked. The entire time I couldn't help but think about how much I regretted asking her for her cell phone number. And this is where things seriously got out of hand. I guess you could tell by my facial expression that I was really freaked out, and that's when she decided to threaten me. She looked me right in the eyes and said that she would kill me if I told anyone. I know what you're thinking. It doesn't sound as bad as it was. If you could see the look in her eyes when she said that to me, you would have been anxious about it too. I continued texting her and acting like nothing happened for a couple of more days. She apologized and said that she gets carried away sometimes. And I gave it about a week before I just kind of straight up blocked her. She really freaked out. I knew I was taking some kind of risk when I did so. I wasn't sure if she was serious when she said that she was actually going to kill me or not. I remember being really paranoid for a couple of days. She didn't know where I lived, but she knew where I went to school, and she had the ability to track down someone that she only had a picture of. I have no idea how she tracked down my ex-girlfriend just from seeing her one time and having one picture of her. The scary part of the story is that she told me that she would end my life and then end herself. She sent it to me as a message, and I read it through email, so I'm not sure how serious she was about it. All I know is that she is an extremely capable person. Again, just think about how much went into finding my ex-girlfriend, or even stalking me on the field trip in the beginning. You couple that level of capability with someone who is seriously mentally unhinged, and you throw a violence threat as icing on the cake, and you got yourself a real recipe for disaster. I really don't want to say anything to anyone because I know that if the word gets out, my reputation could potentially be ruined. People would think that I'd be the kind of person to run and hide and start crying at the first instance of a small goth girl threatening me. I know that's not how the situation is, but I know that's how people would react to it if they heard. It's been a while since I've had any form of communication with Erica. I blocked her email, phone number, and every social media account you can imagine. I'm just hoping that she can let sleeping dogs lie and let me live my life. And as worried as I am about it, I still feel bad for her. I really hope she gets the help that she so desperately needs. This story happened when I was just a little girl. I think it was in the 3rd grade, and I remember the day like it was yesterday. In fact, I don't really remember very much else about that time period. Anyway, I was your pretty average Catholic schoolgirl. I was nice to everyone and came from a pretty good home. The day that it happened was on a field trip. We went to one of those old historic home kinds of places. It was used as some kind of base during the Revolutionary War or something like that. I don't exactly remember what, but I vividly remember making some cornbread the old-fashioned way. That was a really fun experience. Makes me kind of sad that one of the most traumatic experiences in my life happened on the same day. What I want you to understand, though, is that the school itself was very small. I was one of 12 students in this class. It was a fairly expensive school, and that's how it was able to operate that way. All things considered, I actually got a really good education there. The thing about coming from a small school is that you have a very tight-knit community of students, parents, and teachers. There were very few security checks or anything like that, especially when it came to something like one of these field trips. Well, I guess one of the boys in the class had an uncle. He just happened to tag along on the field trip along with his nephew, and nobody batted an eye. Like I said, it was a very trusting community of people, at least until the day this happened, because I'm pretty sure the rules changed after this. The kid's uncle was very strange. He had a really weird mustache and had these creepy sunglasses that covered his eyes in a way that you couldn't tell where he was looking. He may have been looking in a completely different direction, or he may have been looking right in your eye. He never really knew. And that became a problem for me early on in the day. I remember when we were lined up outside of the buses, there he was, just standing there. It seemed like he was looking right at me, and I remember thinking to myself that it would have been really weird if he was. I immediately looked around to see if I was doing something wrong. Being an innocent kid and all, I assumed that I must have dropped something out of my book bag or something. I didn't, though, and I continued standing there, feeling the weight of his gaze on my body. I kept glancing in his direction every couple of seconds to see if he was still looking at me. I really couldn't tell, but I felt like he was. My first impression that he was going to be one of those overbearing and overprotective helicopter parents that comes along and ruins the trip for everyone. Like he was watching out for one of us to make a mistake so he could call us out on it. That first impression was dead wrong. When we got to the house, we split everyone up into groups. There was maybe 50 or 60 people there altogether, and we thought the best way to go about it was to have everyone get into groups of 5. That way, there would be one adult with 4 kids. It worked out perfectly that way. Of course, I ended up with this guy's creepy uncle and his menacing sunglasses. He barely said a word the entire time. I remember looking over at the other groups who had a fun parent with them. This guy was just weird. He seemed like his mind was somewhere else, and it's only after everything happened that I knew exactly where his mind was. It wasn't very long before he did something that crossed many lines. As we were waiting in line to see one of the older historic exhibits, he started to pet my hair. I remember being so weirded out. I remember looking back at him and giving him one of those "what the heck are you doing" kinds of facial expressions. He just smiled at me. He did that and a couple of other extremely odd things to me. I don't think any of it crossed the line into assault, but he did some pretty strange touching. Little things like petting my hair, adjusting my shirt, and other stuff that just made me extremely uncomfortable. And it was so obvious that he was more interested in me than any of the other kids. He practically ignored his nephew, and he paid no mind to the other kids in the group. Thankfully, for my sake, that was the extent of my day with him. One of the teachers caught on to this very strange behavior and pulled this guy aside. He then claimed that there was an emergency at the mechanic shop that he worked in and had to leave immediately. Of course, I know in retrospect that he was probably threatened with some kind of legal action. It's been years since all of this went down, and I found something out very recently that truly shocked me. Well, I still keep in touch with that one friend of mine. I was talking to him on Facebook and we were reminiscing about our days in Catholic school. I asked him about his uncle because I randomly remembered it, and he said that his uncle was in jail for a few more months and was actually about to be released that week. I asked him what he was in for, and what he proceeded to tell me chilled me to the bone. I guess his uncle had been caught with illicit pictures of children on his computer. It was truly disturbing. I don't think he ever acted on his desires in the real world. I'm pretty sure they would have locked him up for good and thrown away the key if he did, but just the thought that someone who was a confirmed predator had touched me like that as a child makes me feel sick to my stomach. So yeah, the moral of the story is no matter how small or close your little community is, there is always the potential for bad actors to enter the scene and forever change the trust amongst everyone else. This is hands down one of the worst things that's ever happened to me, and yet ruined a day that could have otherwise been one of the happiest of my life. I was friends with someone named Jack in middle school and high school. He was a strange guy. He always seemed to get along much better with girls than he did guys, but it wasn't like he was flirting with the girls. He was just better at being friends with them. I now know in retrospect that he was gay, and it explains everything perfectly. But at the time, I just thought he was really good at talking to girls. I first became close with him when I had a study hall class with him. The teacher was extremely rude for absolutely no reason. There was this one time when she told me and Jack to stop talking because other students were trying to work, and not 10 minutes later, she called one of her friends to gossip about something that happened on Facebook. She didn't even leave the room or talk quietly or anything. She just blabbered on about her cousin's horrible Facebook post. That was when me and Jack knew that we had to make our mission to troll this teacher and make her life horrible. And that's how me and Jack became close. We would leave a whoopee cushion on her chair, throw out some of the papers inside of her desk, and other little things like that. It never amounted to malice on our part, but it just felt kind of like revenge, at least in our eyes. And this was one of the first times that I really noticed something about Jack. He loved doing stuff like this. I'm not sure you could call it a streak of rebellion or what, but he definitely loved to make people feel bad. Maybe you could call him something of a sadist. Not to an extreme degree or anything like that, bad enough that it's not an accurate description. Anyway, he came out of the closet sometime in high school during our sophomore year. I was still friends with him, though not as close as we had been when we trolled that teacher. We kind of fell out of contact and stopped hanging out as much after that study hall ended. I was really supportive when he came out of the closet, though. I always had a lot of sympathy for that community. I never quite understood all of the hate that they got, but I just knew it was a really difficult thing to be openly gay. We were in New York State, so people were more accepting than they otherwise would have been. Jack wasn't rejected or denounced by anyone as far as I knew. There were definitely a few guys who were jerks about it. It was still high school after all. But all in all, we lived in a fairly progressive town. Toward the end of our sophomore year, there was going to be one big field trip and everyone looked forward to it. It was going to be a trip to Disney World and we stayed for a couple of days. Like the entire class, or whoever went at least. Those kinds of theme parks always seem kind of lame otherwise because you can only go with your family. I know that might be bad to say, but I always thought those family trips were boring no matter where we went. I always just wanted to go with my friends. I thought that was the best time, and I knew that this was probably going to be the only chance I had to do that. The trip didn't go at all as I had planned. Most of my friends couldn't even go because they were failing a class. I ended up only being able to hang out with Jack. He was pretty much the only person I knew who went on the trip, so I just kind of stuck with him unless I wanted to be alone the entire time, which would have been horrible. But something I didn't really expect happened. When I started hanging out with Jack, he wanted us to ditch his friends. He just wanted it to be me and him, which I thought was pretty weird because I didn't think much of it. The rest of the day went by pretty good. We started pulling innocent pranks on people. It was actually a really fun time. I remember him saying something about it being like how we had done back in study hall. It honestly brought me back to those days too. All in all, it was a great day. But then the time came to go back to the hotel. This was when things got weird, because I noticed that when we started winding down for the day, Jack and his moods seemed a lot different than they had been throughout the day. I don't exactly know how to explain it, but it made me pretty uncomfortable to say the least. And I don't mean like I was in danger kind of uncomfortable, but it was more awkward than anything. After all, outside of that day, me and Jack really weren't that close, and seeing him in such a different way made things a little awkward for me at least, but the night went on. Me and Jack ended up rooming together. The teacher said that we had to be in doubles, and once we had an accountability partner, we were going to be sharing a hotel room. In the back of my mind, I got nervous that Jack was going to try something, but I chalked it up to me just being randomly paranoid. Everything went as you might expect, and we went to sleep in our separate beds. But there was some point throughout the night that he woke me up. I don't know what came over him, but he came to my bed and started doing things of a certain intimate nature. I don't really want to go into too many details, and quite frankly, I think they're pretty disturbing. On top of that, I don't really want to think about it too much. It was kind of traumatic for me, and suffice to say, I was assaulted by him while I was still half asleep. Took me a while to understand what was even going on. I'm a really deep sleeper, so it was really weird. I didn't want to tell anyone because I was worried that people were going to think that I was gay. I know that's probably a horrible thing to think, that I was more worried about my own reputation than my own well-being, but I guess that's how it is with high schoolers and how they think at the end of the day. The rest of the trip was horribly awkward between the two of us. I tried changing out partners, but the teachers wouldn't allow it, so I was stuck hanging out with Jack the rest of the time. I didn't really say all that much to him. On the second half of the last day, he just straight up ditched me and I was left by myself at the snack bar. I just ate food. We haven't really had any contact since. I moved away to go to college, and I don't have any plans of going back to my hometown. My parents retired in Florida anyway, so I don't really have a reason to go back, especially not if Jack is there. When I was much younger, I was considered one of the popular girls. You would think that this would be an amazing privilege, for everyone to look at you and think that you were the best looking person in the room most of the time, to get all the attention from the guys that you could ever want, and sometimes even making other girls jealous felt kinda good. But let me tell you the truth about it. It really sucks. More often than not, I felt kinda bad for the girls who weren't as pretty as me, and I also felt bad for having to constantly reject a bunch of guys who were trying to date me. This was especially bad in high school. I got hit on all the time. It honestly became very distracting. I hadn't had a boyfriend up until that point. I really went out of my way to be a good girl. I always thought that if I just dated any guy that tried to pick me up, I wouldn't get the best guy that I could. So I just waited until I found a guy that I thought was worthwhile. I spent most of my time with my best friend Destiny. Me and her were really close, but I remember she almost got kind of jealous when I finally got something of a boyfriend. Me and this boy, Jake, never actually dated, but we were talking, for lack of a better term. It was one of those situations where people kind of knew that we were somewhat romantically involved. Like, we would talk on the phone at night and sometimes bring each other gifts to school, things like that. People always blew it out of proportion, but it was what it was. I remember Destiny being very disapproving of Jake. She said that he was a loser and that I could do way better than him. He definitely would have not seemed like the first guy I'd have gone after. At first, he isn't the best looking guy in the world, but I think he's really cute. Or at least I did at the time. I thought his real redeeming quality was that he was the most compassionate guy I'd ever met. Unlike most guys, he actually listened to me when I spoke. I felt like he really heard me. And that was of a heck of a lot more than could be said of any other guy that ever tried to date me before. And if I'm going to be honest, I felt more heard by him than anyone I'd ever met up until that point. The sad part was that Jake had quite a few issues. He wasn't just something of a loner. He also had this dark and mysterious side that I didn't really know anything about. Even to this day, I don't really know what was wrong with him. I just know that there is something about him that isn't quite right. And looking back, I was extremely naive to not have seen the signs before. He was disliked by so many people, and it wasn't like your standard reaction where people think he's awkward or something. He totally was, but there was something else that was completely off about him. Even my dog had a bad reaction when I brought him to my house one time, and as anyone should know, if a dog doesn't like you, then there is really something wrong with you. Anyway, nothing bad really happened between us until we had a field trip one day. Our entire grade was going to a theme park about 30 minutes away. It was supposed to be a really fun thing. As long as we stayed in small groups of at least 3, we could pretty much go wherever or do whatever we wanted. The idea of not having to be followed around by a teacher all day was extremely enticing. On the day of the field trip, it ended up being me and Jake and Destiny in a group of 3. He really wanted us to ditch Destiny so we could go and have some fun, but I wasn't about to do that to my best friend, nor did I really want to do anything like that with him on this field trip. Most of the day went by and it was actually pretty fun. There was one point when I had walked by a water slide. Some of the kids who were riding on it splashed some of the water and got me completely soaked. I had a spare shirt in my book bag and I went to the girls' locker room to change. But this is where things got weird. There was no one in the girls' locker room. I went in there and started to change, and then I heard someone else walk in. I just assumed it was another girl or a woman. It was a pretty crowded day after all, but no, it was Jake. He started touching me very inappropriately. I told him that I really wanted to do stuff with him, but just not under these kind of circumstances. But he wasn't getting the hint, and it really started to freak me out. I could feel it in his pants rubbing against my leg. His breath got heavier and heavier, and he got himself really worked up. Finally, I just had to yell at him to stop. I told him that he was really freaking me out, and I just got the rest of my clothes and I walked out. But he didn't follow me. He just let me leave. I stood outside of the girls' room for a few minutes waiting for him to come out, but it was a little while before he did, probably close to 5 minutes. As you might imagine, I was not excited to go back in there and get him. Destiny also gave me a look when I came out. I told her that Jake was in there, but I didn't tell her what he was doing. She just asked why he was in the girls' locker room at all. I couldn't think of a good excuse. I didn't want to tell her that he was being a complete and total creep with me that day. Destiny was fed up because she wanted to go buy a pretzel. She knocked on the girls' locker room door and told Jake that he needed to come out right now. We stood there for a few seconds and we all heard some strange grunting noises. It was honestly really awkward, and me and Destiny just stood there and looked at each other. Jake finally made out one last grunting noise and a few seconds later walked outside. He didn't say a word. He was kind of out of breath, and it was one of the most awkward moments of my life. We told him that we were going to get a pretzel, and he just shook his head. He slowly followed behind us as we made our way to the snack bar. At the time, I don't think I consciously knew it, but now that I'm a little older, I think I have a pretty good idea of what he was doing in there. As you might imagine, that was the end of mine and Jake's little romance. That was the creepiest thing I've ever seen anyone do, and it was so shocking coming from him. I felt like I'd spent so much time getting to know him only to find out that he was even creepier than all the other guys.
So this happened back in 6th grade, and I think it's the closest I've ever come to dying. At the school I went to, we always used to have some big end-of-the-year field trip. We'd usually go to some city and look at all the important or historic buildings, have lunch, learn some things, and leave. That year, we were going to New York, and me and a couple of friends planned what we wanted to do. We wanted to go do our own thing, go shopping, get some new clothes, that kind of thing. Only when we got to school the next day, the teachers made it really clear we had to stick with the group. But since we were all stupid, rebellious 6th graders, we decided we'd just have to work around that. On the ride to New York, me, my friend Olivia, and my friend Devin decided we were going to leave the group and do whatever we wanted. Our class was pretty big, almost 60 of us, because they put 5th, 6th, and 7th graders together. So we thought if we weren't gone too long, nobody would notice. We had brought money and we had planned on buying tons of stuff, because even though we were a big class, we lived in a small town with only a couple of stores. Olivia loved shopping, and she had actually researched the area we were going to be around and picked out all the good stores. She even made us a little map. She was good at that kind of stuff. Anyways, when we got to New York, Devin chickened out because his parents were pretty strict and he didn't want to get his phone taken away again. Olivia and I just decided that he could just give us some money and we'd buy his stuff for him. So we did that, and after they herded everyone off the bus, we kind of lingered back. We were right about them being distracted by everyone else because we got away no problem. Olivia's map worked out pretty good, and we were gone probably around 10 or 20 minutes before things started getting crazy. We had just left the store, and Olivia was carrying her shopping bags when this guy noticed us. It probably wasn't hard to pick us out. 2 little 6th graders walking around alone, carrying a ton of clothes. He started calling out to us, saying how he could buy us more clothes, all the jewelry we wanted, and if only we would just come with him. We didn't believe him, of course. We just kept walking, heading on to the next store. Only this guy wouldn't stop talking. He started following us now, and getting kind of angry that we wouldn't answer him. I told him to buzz off because I thought that he would take a hint. There were tons of people around, and we figured he couldn't really kidnap us in front of 200 people. But he kept following us, and he started getting a lot closer. He had probably been 30 or 40 yards back, where we could barely see him over the people, but now he was only 15 or 20 feet. And that's when we started panicking, because God, there's a potential kidnapper after us, and we had no idea where the group was. We decided to split off from the sidewalk and head down into some alley because we figured people would call out the guy if he started following us. But of course, it was New York, and everybody else was wrapped up in their own little problems. So now we're walking down this dark alley, and this guy is still after us. He fell a little back, probably back to about 30 feet now, but now he's not pretending to be a good guy. He's talking about how he's going to kill us, and how they're never going to find our bodies, and how much fun he's going to have with us, and he's smiling this deranged grin the whole time. We're both on the verge of tears now, because we figured this sociopath is about to have his way with us. Olivia just decides to drop her stuff and yells, "Run!" So we both start booking it, and we're probably around halfway through this alley. But then she turns around and she screams. So I turn around and I see this psychopath is now running after us too, and he has a knife. We're both screaming now, and I'm running faster than I ever have before, and we just run out of the alley back into this crowd of people. And as we try to get into this group of people to make sure this guy can't stab us to death, I turn around and he's just standing back in the alley, smiling. And I turn back around and this random lady is asking us what's wrong because we're both sobbing and Olivia's dress is ripped and I'm bleeding because my arms scrape the wall and we're crying so hard we can barely talk. As soon as we can actually manage to talk, we tell her about our school, and she looks it up and calls them, and we somehow manage to find our group again. We're both forced to stay right next to the teacher because they don't trust us anymore, and I honestly don't blame them. We didn't even tell them about the man though, and as soon as I get home, I'm grounded and my phone is taken away. But still, nobody but me and Olivia knows about that man. School ends a couple of days later and I get my phone back, so I text Olivia and she sends me a picture of our class in front of some important building and says, "Look in the bottom left corner." And that man is in it, mostly hidden behind some wall, but you can still see his face, smiling that deranged grin for the camera. We never really talked about the man again. I didn't want to bring it up and Olivia didn't either. I'm terrified of cities now. I like to stick to a couple of towns near me and that's it. There's a much lower chance of running into any psychopaths. I'm a 15-year-old male. I live in Germany, but I come from a small European country. This event had happened before I moved to Germany. In my country, we have field trips, usually at the end of 8th grade, that last for a week or so. Now, I've had my fair share of stalkers, but nothing like this. It was September in 2014 and I went to a field trip on an island with my class. I was 14 at the time. There was this girl, Jane. Jane used to be a normal girl up until that point. She was always kind of shy and really kept to herself, but everyone liked her. She was never bullied or anything, just a normal shy girl. We used to chat on Facebook a little bit, but nothing serious. I never really harbored any feelings towards her, neither in her favor nor against her. Now, back to the field trip. I've smoked a couple of cigarettes with my mates in our hotel room, and then we met outside. The teacher wanted to show us some plants that were specific for that area. Now, I've noticed that Jane was talking to me more often than before, and that she had walked very near to me, but I thought that that was merely a coincidence. I didn't make a fuss about it, but as time went by, things had started to get worse. She started touching me, hugging me, and following me, respectively. On the third day, we went on a cruise to a nearby island, and during the cruise, she was sitting next to me. She had a camera and was taking pictures of me. I had zero sense of restraint at that point since I was young and didn't think much of it. I've noticed that she was taking a suspicious amount of photos, mostly of me, and I told her to calm down. Then she talked to me for an hour, but she didn't say anything interesting. She was mimicking the Irish and British accents to me and basically blabbering stuff for approximately an hour. And I was just smiling and replying with, "That's nice." In the following days, she had started to hug me and make me feel uncomfortable, so one day I came to her and told her that we needed to talk in private. We went to the woods and I asked her if she was in love with me or something like that. She denied it and kept saying that there had been a misunderstanding, but I knew that there was something off about her. Then she told me her life story. She said that her mother is a schizophrenic and that she's severely depressed about it. I felt sorry for her, but still, her and that touching was incredibly inappropriate. During our conversation, my mates wondered where I am and organized a search party for me. They found us eventually, but she had decided to stay behind and let me go. I have no idea what she was doing after I left. On one occasion, I'm a little fuzzy about the details, She came into our hotel room asking for water, as if there wasn't any water in her own room. However, when she got the requested water, she refused to leave the room. We got rid of her by telling her that we were going out to have some fun. The next day, the harassing got even worse. She would follow me around and hug me. The peak of her abnormal behavior happened in the evening. I took a walk with a friend of mine and turned around briefly only to see her behind us. She was following us, I kid you not. I have never felt this kind of dread in my whole life. We have made our way down the shore and I hid behind a big rock next to a police station. "We should go inside and tell the police we have a stalker," my friend joked. Anyway, she couldn't find us and gave up finally. My best friend heard the story and went to her room to tell her to screw off. I was infuriated with him because it was rude of him regardless of her actions. I'm usually not meek, but I thought that was horrible. Now I see that no matter how cruel that was, it was the right thing to do. I went to her room and apologized for my friend's actions. She was in her bed sobbing uncontrollably, and I calmed her down and went outside. A female friend of mine, Sarah, had invited me to come to her room so we could discuss something. I made my way to her room and saw 2 other girls there. We sat on the chairs in her balcony, and she had told me that Jane is a very depressed person who had done some self-harming in the past. I was shocked when I had heard that. So, amidst our conversation, I winced. I raised my look and saw Jane, maybe 50 meters or 160 feet away, just sitting on a rock, listening to music and staring at me. She had a solemn look in her eyes. I suddenly felt dismay and told my friends that we have a spectator. They winced too, and we decided to pry on her a little bit before backing out to the bedroom. "Just stay away from her," was the last thing Sarah told me before I left. To my luck, it was the end of our field trip and I finally got some rest. Weird encounters with her became fewer and fewer because she was often absent from school. Later I found out that she had overdosed on sleeping pills a couple of times but survived all of those occurrences. There was even a rumor that she had ended up in a psychiatric institution, but I have no proof of that and I can't tell you in confidence. The point of the story is that sometimes you have to be rude so you can prevent something like this from happening to you. It may seem cruel or it might even hurt the other person, but in the end, it's your life and you have to stand up for yourself and make sure that you're happy first. This happened to me some time ago, back when I was 10. On a field trip to a group of cabins some 70 kilometers or so from the city I lived in. The point of the trip was basically just to have fun. We weren't being taught much other than how to make shelters and light a fire in the rain. For the most part, we were supposed to spend the majority of the time just fooling around, playing tag and swimming in the nearby lake, and maybe playing board games inside the cabins when it was pouring outside. Things turned out to be less fun, at least during the first 2 days. At first, the trip seemed great. We got to choose our own roommates. There were 4 rooms in each of the 4 cabins, and my group of friends and I obviously chose one together. There were 4 of us in total. Myself, an Indian guy, a Canadian, this happened in Canada, and a Chinese guy. Neither of us had ever been on a trip like this before, so far from home and in the middle of a mountainous forest. When we got there, we took a tour which was led by the camp's coordinator, this 20-something-year-old with shoulder-length blonde hair. He showed us the cabins, the lakes, the trails, and the kitchen and lunchrooms, and then stressed us that it was important that we not wander off far from the cabins since, being in a forest at the base of a mountain, the chances of getting lost were relatively high. So we finished the tour, ate dinner, and then we were guided to bed as we had arrived somewhat late. My friends and I were extremely excited, what with this being our first time sleeping away from home and everything. The Canadian friend had the, at the time, seemingly brilliant idea to share ghost stories while we got ready for bed. We each came up with a fictional character that would creep out kids or murder people or something. I came up with this idea of someone called Psycho, who would hide behind the shower curtains and then stab you when you stepped inside. For the record, no one showered during the 4 days we were there. The Indian guy came up with this typical under-the-bed monster who would grab your legs as you got close to the bed frame and drag you under. As the hours passed and lights out drew closer, we started to get the creeps. By the time the lights out hit 2 hours later, we were so high-strung with a combination of excitement and nerves that everyone, excluding me, decided to share one bed, even though there were two of them. The Indian guy's story about grabbing your ankles and being dragged under the bed monster unnerved us to the point that we jumped onto the beds from nearby pieces of furniture rather than have to walk near the bottoms. As I mentioned previously, I decided to sleep on my own because 3 people in one bed, even 10 years old, was awkward, and this being summer, it was hot. We talked for a bit before turning off the lights and falling asleep, but I was awoken some hours later by what sounded like whispering. I didn't move at first, since the stories we had shared while getting ready for bed were still in my mind. And then I recognized the voices and realized my friends were the ones whispering from over on the other side of the room in their bed. So I relaxed for a moment, and I was about to call out and ask what they were discussing when the Indian guy, apparently unaware that I had woken up, hissed, "What's it doing?" Immediately, the thought of some monster looming over my bed took to my mind, and I froze, eyes darting around in the darkness. I didn't see anything, as the room was empty and it was too dark to make out the distinctive forms of my friends in the other bed. "It's looking at him," said the Chinese guy, and then added, "Do you think it will break the window?" And then I looked at the window. It was one of those floor-to-ceiling ones with a latch that opened up to a balcony. Standing in the balcony, pressed up against the glass, was the silhouette of a person. The curtains were drawn, but they were white and thin, and we could still see the warped shadow of the person, illuminated from behind by the dim light of the moon. The man, it was almost certainly a man, was holding a long pole with a wide end, similar to a sledgehammer or even an axe. I whispered, "Guys?" The man outside didn't move, but the Chinese guy did. I didn't know how he even worked up the courage to do this, but he crawled out of bed and slowly worked his way to the side of the window, duck low, all commando style. He reached forwards, grabbing the curtains, and was about to peek between the fabric when the man outside knocked on the glass. The poor Chinese friend jumped so badly that he pulled hard on the curtain, causing the entire thing to rip off the railing, letting us see the person outside. He was dressed in black, aside from a pair of orange shorts, and had a ski mask on. What he held in his hands was actually a shovel, rather than a hammer or axe. Nevertheless, the 4 of us were terrified. The Chinese guy screamed and bolted for the door, and in less than a second, the 4 of us were scrambling out of bed and hightailing it for the exit, screaming all the while. My Indian friend tripped along the way, and the Chinese friend was in such a rush that he slammed into the door, causing the lock to nearly snap. In seconds, we were in the cabin's lobby, and everyone else was rushing out of their rooms to see what had happened, teacher included. She had her own room. We told the teacher, in terrified gasps, what had happened, and she went to investigate, but found nothing. The person had disappeared. After that, it took about an hour before we were convinced to even step back into our room. I clambered into bed with my friends despite their protests, and we stayed awake for the remaining 4 hours or so, hands clutched around our flashlights. The curtains remained open. The next day passed normally, and though we talked about the event, we soon forgot ourselves in the blur of activities that the camp counselor set for us. We ate lunch, fooled around, ate dinner, and then, with no small amount of dread, walked back to the cabins and got ready for bed. The same guy actually came back, but to a different cabin this time. When we woke up and headed for breakfast hall, a group of girls were talking about the man with the shovel, and after talking with them for a bit, we realized that they had experienced the same thing as us. We were just about to go to the teacher and explain that there was someone out there trying to murder us little kids, when the camp's coordinator, a 20-something with blonde hair, walked into the breakfast hall, wearing the exact same orange shorts the man outside of our balcony had been wearing. He denied everything when our group questioned him, and we didn't dare take the matter to the other camp counselors or even our teachers. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but judging by the shorts, it was almost definitely him. At the time, it freaked me out to think that one of the camp's counselors was doing this sort of thing. We suspected him for murder and a whole host of other things, but looking back at the trip, he was probably just a bored young adult trying to make an otherwise repetitive job as a counselor more exciting. Still, I hate to think about how depraved he must have been to scare 10-year-olds in that way, possibly leaving them with trauma or emotional scarring. This happened to me when I was in first grade, so about 6 or 7 years old. I'm now in my mid-20s. Every year, the first graders take a trip to the zoo, about an hour away from our town. I was a shy little girl, so I spent most of the bus ride staring out the window while the other kids were busy conversing with each other. A Jeep pulls up where I have a clear look into the vehicle and at the driver. We were on the interstate. I am seeing him playing with something under his shirt, all the while looking at me and then back at the road, back at me and so forth. One hand on the wheel and the other fiddling with whatever was under his shirt. I couldn't keep my eyes off of him, fascinated about what he was hiding. And then he lifted his shirt. And yup, I got a good look at what he was playing with the whole time. He freaking waved at me. Granted, I was a little girl and had never seen one before, nor did I understand why he was doing what he was doing. A girl that was near me asked what I was looking at, and then she got to see for herself. She started hollering, and I swear to God, all the kids on the bus ran to the window to see what was going on. The Jeep gunned off, and I'm sure it got off the next exit. I remember telling my mom about it when I got home, but then I just sort of blocked it out of my mind. It was only several years later when I had 2 daughters of my own that I recalled this event, and just last night I was talking to my mom about it, wishing that I had been more mature and had thought to get his license plate number or something. All I remember is that it was a Jeep or SUV of some type and some middle-aged white guy. I just hope and pray to God that I, nor any other child in their life, ever has to go through or see something like that again.
Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and remember to always read the outro.